Hello, I'm Sharon Healy. I'm President of Parents Victoria, and it is my very great honour this afternoon now, to introduce Danielle Cronin to you. Her bio is in your papers, so feel free to read that. We're a bit short on time, so I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to share one fun fact. Apparently it was a fun fact. Danielle is currently expecting her fourth child, so she has definitely been engaging in some parental activity. It's obviously going very well, so we'll now hand over to Danielle.
And if learning happens from womb to tomb, then I'm certainly doing the womb learning at the moment. Now we're running about 10 minutes over time, so I'm actually going to sort of condense my presentation a little bit. So it's going to be slightly ironic. When we're talking about engaging, I think we should model that and actually engage our audiences in the work that we're doing. Because of the time limitations, I'm actually going to probably do go a bit old school and sort of talk at you. I thought it was this morning when Peter Garrigan was talking about, well, what does engagement mean for individuals? How do we think about what engagement means? It truly made my heart sing, Peter, when you talked about the fact that it can be about valuing and recognising what families do at home every day. And for some families, that is literally just getting their kids to school ready to learn. And an engaged parent isn't necessarily a parent that a school sees every day. And from a personal perspective, I might very well be one of those hard-to-reach parents at my own children's school, because I'm very rarely in my own state, let alone my own home, let alone my own school. But I would consider myself an engaged parent. I have, learning conversations with my kids. So last night I'm on the phone listening to the 8-year-old do their home reader. Before I left yesterday in a mad rush to get down to Canberra, I scribbled on the front window of the house next to the front door using one of those chalk pens for my reluctant homework doer that before he went to rugby, he needed to do these dot points and please call me when he'd done them. So it's how parents engage with their children. And I think for me, the use of ICT is a way that I'm engaged when I'm not at home and when I'm not in New South Wales. And so I can, if we effectively use, for example, school intranets and those sorts of things, I know what my kids are supposed to be doing, I know what they're learning, and I begin to ask the right sorts of questions of my kids. So rather than those, who did you play with today? Nobody. What did you do? Nothing. What homework have you got? Don't have any. I can sort of say, well, Oscar, I know that you've got a project on Antarctica that's due in week 10. Where are you up to? So it changes the conversation that we have, but I don't need to be at school to change that way of thinking and being a parent engaging with the school. Now, the purpose of this session is actually to follow on from Di, to talk about one of the other outputs of the National Collaboration Project into parental engagement in low SES communities. And that was around the development of a toolkit or a resource to assist schools to identify where they are, but more importantly, to move along a continuum. So that whole sense of continuous improvement. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge particularly the work of the New South Wales Department of Education and Communities that was contracted to actually write this tool on behalf of all the states and territories and all the jurisdictions, and in particular Marg Hunter and Robin Graham and the team that worked with them to do this work. It was a mammoth task. And I think they really captured the essence of what the task force was on about incredibly well. We recognised that certain states or some states around the country had progressed this work in quite detailed ways, New South Wales being one of them, Victoria another, and that whatever resource or whatever tool, and there's Mark over there, whatever tool that we created had to actually address the needs of all states and territories and jurisdictions and schools, wherever they were. So if they hadn't commenced this work, it had to be a useful tool for them. But it also had to further the work and further the thinking of those schools and jurisdictions that were quite advanced in this work. And I think we've kind of achieved that balance. And I think that is all credit to Marg and her team for doing that. So that's kind of, I suppose, the why of a toolkit. But in terms of what informed, I suppose I'll take one step back. This is kind of what we're going to talk about in this session. this is what the toolkit or the tool looks like. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you the link. It's finally live on the DY Smarter Schools site, so that you actually be able to play with this site at your own leisure later on. The idea behind it was that after we did a literature review, we talked to other experts in the field, a whole range of stakeholders, and schools, principals and parents and others. We identified that there was a gap, I suppose, even in those jurisdictions that were quite advanced, and that was around some sort of a tool that was outcomes focused, that it was linked to the National Family School Partnership Framework and the 7 key dimensions of effective practice, that could be incorporated into a school's school improvement process. So it could be built in, not sort of bolted on. And that provided easy and clear links to the plethora of resources that currently exist out there. So it was a way of bringing together all of those resources into almost like a one-stop shop. And the outcome of all of that thinking and doing and planning and mapping was an interactive PDF. So it's a rich PDF in the sense that it almost operates like a PowerPoint slide. You can work your way through it. It's hyperlinked to different documents and other PDFs within the document, and it can take you outside the document to other websites and all those sorts of things. So it becomes a bit of a hub for information, a bit of a clearinghouse within this really neat package. You can download it, so you can actually download a paper copy of it, but it does work best when it's accessed online and you can take yourself off of this sort of, do you remember those choose your own adventure books sort of in the 80s? It's kind of like that. You can choose your own adventure as you work through this resource. This resource, which we'll unpack in a little while, is supported by some other key outputs of the task force. And I commend them to you, and I think they are actually documents and resources that should actually, they're companion documents, if you like, and you should have them with you as you work through the tool. The first is the annotated resource list. So the task force looked at everything that was currently available in Australia that was worth looking at and compiled it into this really beaut annotated resource list. I think it's probably one of the most valuable outputs of the task force, I think, particularly from a school's perspective or a practitioner perspective. Then there's the report on the case studies, and we've just heard about one brilliant example at Toukley, but the others are all sort of listed there. It's another really neat resource to have beside you as you do this work. And of course, then there's the abridged version of the case studies, which is the third document. In terms of the other things that informed our thinking, it was really very much around Joyce Epstein's work, that there needed to be an acknowledgement of that children learn everywhere. And that when we're working in partnership, so when schools are working in partnership, they're bringing the 3 spheres or the various spheres of a child's life together. That was kind of where we sort of began with our thinking. The other conceptual framework that we used was, of course, the National Family School Partnership Framework itself. So we believed that all the work that we had to do had to hinge off both the theory and the research, but also the frameworks that we already had existing in Australia. And this, if you haven't read this document, and I'm guessing most of you probably have, it's really well worth a read before you embark on any major project in this area. The other element to this was that we recognised that we had to move beyond those random acts of parent and family engagement with schooling, that we did need to be more systemic and more planned in our approach, as Anne very eloquently put it to us this morning. So the other element too, and we've talked about this a lot this morning, is that schools need to provide opportunities for parents to be involved in the life of the school. But perhaps more critically, schools needed to provide opportunities for parents to be part of the learning in the school. So that's where that qualitative shift was coming from, and that was very much in our thinking when we were drafting the actual toolkit. So that focus on learning was a very, very deliberate attempt. So what does the tool look like and how might it be used? I'm going to escape. This is where it's going to get technologically challenged. So this is what it looks like if you were to pull it up on your screen. We're going to focus, basically there are 4 key areas to the resource. Now just hang on, go to 4. So there are 4 key sections. The first section looks at what is family and community engagement? Section 2 looks at, well, why is it important? Section 3 is, well, how do you go about strengthening that sort of engagement? And Section 4 is the case study. So Di's already taken us through sort of Section 4. I'm actually going to focus on Section 3 because I think this is a pretty informed audience and we know why this is what it is and why it's important. And I think what's new about this resource is actually the Section 3. So steps to strengthen parent and community engagement. Oops, hang on. Not used to using a PC. So the whole idea is that this is something that schools can build into their school review and improvement process, that schools take themselves a process of self-reflection, so data collection, analysing that data, then looking at, well, where do we fit against some objective measures of effective practice. So in a sense, well, data can tell you where you are at this precise moment, but it doesn't necessarily tell you where you are. So this resource then sort of begins to unpack that and you can sort of schools can begin to plot themselves on a continuum of practice. There are tools within the tool to document all of this, and we'll have a look at some of those. But it's also about, well, how do schools go about planning and implementing the priorities they've identified during their analysis phase, and then how do you go about evaluating? And the whole idea is that schools don't move from point A to point B overnight, that there is a process of gradual improvement and change and refinement as you go, and that's kind of how we anticipate the tool would be used in a school. Oops. The tool then provides a menu, if you like, or a suite of available tools that schools can use. So if we get the data collection stage, we haven't stipulated that there is one key tool that a school should use, but it's provided a whole range of tools that schools might use to start a conversation or to do quite in-depth situational analyses. So the key question for a school becomes, what do we want to achieve from the process? If a school only wants to get a bit of a temperature reading, like, where are we? How do we think we're travelling in this parenting engagement kind of space? There are tools on this site that would provide you with those sorts of tools. So discussion starters, how you might host a workshop or a focus group, how you might sort of use post-it note activities to collect data from the key stakeholders in the school. Really simple things like that to really quite complex tools like surveys that are linked to the framework, situational analyses like the New South Wales Department of Ed formulated. So schools need to decide what is it they want to achieve and then choose the tool that meets those particular objectives. And we think that this resource provides that degree of flexibility for schools. So that's at the data collection phase. In terms of identifying priorities for action and analysing where you are in terms of that data, there is a school reflection matrix, and I think this is probably the most the innovative part of this tool. So to illustrate how what the matrix looks like and how a school might use it, I'm actually going to use a bit of a case study of a school that we've worked with that use this tool. So I'll go back to here. So this is an example of a school. It's a primary school. Just to give you, you have to read it in too much detail, but basically it's a school that has an incredibly high non-English speaking background population, small Indigenous. It's an urban primary school, really wanted to do some quite detailed work in this area. So they undertook a survey of their parents, their staff, some community members, the school leadership, to look at where the school fits across those 7 key dimensions. They used one of the surveys from the toolkit, and administered it to the school community. Got, I would argue, a fairly high response rate given some of the challenging circumstances in this particular school. And there's a bit of a story behind that. So here are their results. One of the interesting things that they found in even going down the survey path was that they recognised that a lot of the families were of Vietnamese background, and that English or English literacy, reading of English was a challenge. So they made sure that they translated the survey into Vietnamese, for example. What they didn't realise were not only were the families not literate in English, but nor were they in Vietnamese. Bit of a conundrum. Straight away, they've got a very clear message where they probably need to focus some of their priorities around communication. So what they did then is embarked on a really, I think, admirable effort to get as many families responding to this survey as possible in the most creative ways they could. And that did involve, setting up, capturing parents wherever they were, so at the school gate before and after school, at parent meetings, they hosted a big evening, had interpreters there, had the translated surveys, lots of things, but they spent an incredible amount of time and effort to really hear the voices of those parents that didn't rely on them needing to be able to read in any language, and got that sort of a response rate. Pretty extraordinary effort. Their data, and this is just the parent data, and each of those dimensions across the bottom just relate to various questions in the survey. Where they decided that they needed to focus some attention was around communication, clearly. But in particular, what the survey was telling them was that parents felt that there weren't enough opportunities for parents and teachers to learn from each other in their communications. So whether it's at parent-teacher interviews or in any other forum. And that they weren't having those learning conversations. And so these are actually coming out, these are actually under communication, those dot points are actually sort of questions within the survey. And this is where parents are coming back saying they felt that work needed to be done. The second area was around consultative decision making. So parents were telling them that the school needs to work with them more around, key decisions in the school. And that around collaborating beyond the school, parents were saying that they didn't feel that community resources were being leveraged well enough or used well enough. So the school took this information and said, okay, that's kind of where we are today, but where are we? And this is where the tool became a really useful example. The reflection matrix provides templates across each of the 7 key dimensions of the framework, and then outlines elements of effective practice under each of those key dimensions. So for this particular school, if communication was going to be their priority, they looked at the template for communication. Then they looked at the elements of effective practice, and they began to plot themselves across the tool. For each of those key dimensions, they decided whether or not they were at what stage they were at. So we're not quite there yet. Are we at the developing? Are we at the building? Are we at the sustaining stage? Or do we don't have enough information? This particular school was able to sort of say, look, we don't think we're not quite there in some aspects, and we're developing in others. So we'll bridge the two. And so for each of those key dimensions, then they're able to give themselves an overall ranking for communication. So this is a way of distilling a lot of information, a lot of data that you might collect about your communities into a really neat, simple tool to help you move forward. Essentially, that's what the toolkit is. There are templates within the toolkit for you then to further consolidate that information or to capture the perspectives of different stakeholders in your community. So there are tools in there for individuals within the school to make their own personal reflections on what the data is telling them. So for example, this might be the school principal in this case, saying, okay, I'm looking at the data and this is what it's telling me against all of the 7 key dimensions. This is my personal view. There's a built-in process where the principal and others can sit down and compare their results. Have we come up with consistent understandings of where we think the school is at? If not, how can we have a conversation, start a conversation about why we have conflicting or different views about the same dimension? And a classic example would be not this school, but another school where the parents around consultative decision making were incredibly happy and felt completely engaged in the key decision making in that school. When they interviewed the teachers and the school leadership, they said parents were not involved in any way, shape or form in the decision-making affecting the school. That provided a rich opportunity to talk about, well, why were those views so diametrically, different? So these are the sorts of tools that are in there that can spark those sorts of conversations among the different stakeholders, and to begin to sort of narrow your thinking. Because when we're talking about family-school partnerships, one of the learnings that we had was that schools find this incredibly daunting work when you lob sort of the reflection matrix on the table and the family-school partnership and say, go crazy, find out where you are. This process, I think, is really neat, is it because it starts off with the big picture stuff and just consistently narrows your thinking to those sorts of things that really you need to focus on and the things that will really make a difference in your school community. And so these sorts of questions just help that process. And this school identified communication as the key one for them. Oops. There are pro formas in there for then about, well, how do you then take communication and then do something with it? So then how do you identify what strategies, what types of communication are effective, and how are we going to implement it, when, who's going to do it, how will we know it's worked, those sorts of things. This little interactive, neat PDF means that you can get to that point in the process and say, well, okay, where to from here? You can delve back in at that point and look at all of the case studies, but around the key dimension that you're particularly focusing on. So again, it's assisting schools move from that big picture to the narrow picture. So this school, identified communication, can go back into the tool and home in on that particular dimension. Look at case studies, look at a range of tools and resources that have been developed by school authorities and others to support effective communication. And in this case, what would support effective communication in a highly multicultural, non-English speaking background? Schools can pull down these resources and implement them straight away or build them into their plan. So in that sense, it's a really neat one-stop shop. What else is neat about it is that because it links off to these other pre-existing resources, there is a wealth of stuff that schools can tap into with very little effort. These are just some, two examples. Another one that I would add would be the Department of Education and Communities in New South Wales Priority Schools website. Some fantastic resources on there as well. And again, using those 7 key dimensions. So if this school's interested in communication, they could go to the Partners for Learning site, which is another New South Wales site. Click on the dimension around communication, and there are a whole suite, a whole repertoire of different sort of communication tools that school can pull down and implement in their classrooms, in their schools sort of tomorrow. It's making it as simple as we possibly can for schools to do this work. Another key learning that we had was that sometimes we needed to turn this on its head to make schools engage with it. We found that a lot of schools were really, really daunted by the tool. And so we developed it in consultation with Victoria, the Department of Ed in Victoria, another little tool that can be slotted into this, so that rather than schools assessing where they are against each of the 7 key dimensions, they assess where they want to be according to what the educational goals or priorities of the schools are at the present time. And it's kind of what Toukley did, I think, with around their retention goals. So, for example, if literacy is a really big focus in your school at the moment, what can you do around parent and community engagement and homeschool partnerships to achieve gains in literacy of the kids? So we sort of said to some of these schools who are really kind of finding it really difficult to sort of conceptualise how they could do this work, you tell us what your focus is. So what's currently in your school plan that you really want to affect change around? Now, I have to say, these are 2 really poorly written goals, but to illustrate the point, if, for example, you sort of said, look, we really want to improve the literacy of the boys in Year 3, so that in the 2012 cohort, and we want to be able to see some improvement in 2013. That's a goal that we've got for this particular year. Or you might be looking at some non-academic goals around, we want to improve the attendance of all kids in our school from 85% to 95%. So identify what it is that your school, the core business of your school is, and then begin to think about, well, against those 7 key dimensions, how are we going to communicate more effectively with parents around, for example, literacy? And it might be, in particular, the parents of Year 3 boys in literacy. How might we connect home and school learning around literacy development? So what opportunities can we provide to parents to learn about how children learn to read? What opportunities are we going to provide to parents to give them the skills to assist children at home around literacy? What programs or initiatives can we put in place that support literacy learning for that cohort of boys? Now, this was actually a goal that a school in Victoria had, and that we were working with. I don't think Marg Orm is in the room, but this school decided, okay, not only have we identified it as a goal, we're going to use parent and community engagement to achieve that goal, and we're going to make it measurable. Like, we wanted to know that this has had a measurable impact on the academic achievement of these kids. And they initiated a program called Balls Bites, five Bs, Balls Bites, basketball and something. But it was a program directed at dads or father figures in the boys' lives. It involved partnerships with the community, so the local library. There was even a local church involved, because the church, this is a government school, but the church used the school hall. So for those kids who didn't have father figures at home, some of those men stepped up to the plate. So it was really a school looking out beyond its own 4 walls to see how it could build the capacity of fathers to influence their children, their sons' literacy levels. And the program's been going for about 2 years now. And so, of course, they've got 2 sets, NAPLAN data, but other data that they've collected to be able to compare. And they're saying very passionately that the work that they did around engaging fathers in their boys' learning around literacy has had a measurable impact on those boys' literacy results. And in particular in this school, they knew that the girls were outperforming the boys dramatically in that first year. And by the second year, the boys were beginning to outperform the girls. And so they were really beginning to be able to track what they did around parent and community engagement and linking it to the achievement of the kids. There's also going to be a case study tomorrow, I think, from a secondary boys' high school that also had a particular focus on boys' literacy in Year 9. And and I commend the workshop to you, because it's about how did they use parents to engage with the learning of literacy for Year 9 boys to make some significant changes. So for me, getting buy-in from schools, this was sometimes a better approach than using the matrix in its pure form. So that's just one of the learnings that we've got from sort of working around New South Wales and Victoria over the last sort of 5 months or so. So as part of that process, when we're drilling down into, what actually makes a difference? Like, what sort of things would you build into that plan? We're trying to move schools from just looking at, well, we're going to host an evening, we're going to host a curriculum night, and the focus is going to be around literacy. Or we're going to, call parents to a forum about the importance of, attendance. Moving schools from just thinking about what do you do to parents to, well, how do you actually foster greater engagement with those key messages? And how might those traditional involvement activities be reconceptualised to be in vehicles for greater engagement? And the conversations that we were having around the tables about this kind of a conversation was profound, and I think quite transformational for some of the schools, because it meant that they were having different sorts of conversation with parents in different places, so not necessarily on the school site, but to achieve the educational goals of the school that also met the needs of the parents. So it was a win-win situation. And I think a lot of schools actually found having a conversation around this incredibly liberating, because it meant that schools didn't have to do all of this work alone. It was identifying who else in the community could also assist building the engagement of families and the engagement of students in their learning. So this is just an example of what a school might do. So what are some of the other lessons from the field? As part of the task force's work, each jurisdiction was given some money to go and promote the tool in their jurisdiction. I partnered up, so we've been doing some work in New South Wales in Catholic Ed, but we also partnered up with the Victorian Department of Education and ran a series of sort of statewide forums around supporting the rollout of this tool. So taking school leadership teams, partnership brokers and others who work with and around schools and parent leaders around the why of parent engagement, the how of parent engagement, and how you can use the tool to strengthen that engagement. And so I think over the last 5 months or so, between the two of us, between me and sort of Victoria, we've reached probably about 600 schools and school leaders, and the overwhelming response has been, or the aha moment I think for all the schools has been between that involvement and that engagement stuff. The other aha moment is that they don't have to use this tool verbatim. They don't have to start at point A and finish at point B. It's a tool that you can dip into and dip out of and take what you want from, add to, adapt in any way that suits you. And that was liberating. Because one of the first questions we got at one of the very first forums was, where's the compliance around this? Are we going to be made to do this? Is this going to be the thin end of the wedge? That was kind of what we were getting from the school principals. And we're saying no. This is about you starting wherever you are. If you're not ready, don't embark on it yet. If you think you are ready, then start the journey, do it slowly, involve as many key people as you can, and start a conversation, perhaps, is the first place to start. So that was kind of liberating to know that, A, there's no compliance around it, but also that you can dip in and dip out as you need to. So from a system level, this is to give you an idea of how it's been rolled out in two different jurisdictions. In Victoria, they have embedded this tool, or beginning to embed this tool, into their FAPL site. And their FAPL site is the Families and Partners in Learning website that Sharon Butler was instrumental in getting up in Victoria. So they're sort of saying to schools, look, this is a rich repository of resources you might want to complement the national resource with. But they're also saying we've got staff in the office, in the central office, who are prepared to support you in the implementation. So we've got a partnership team. We're happy to work with schools in implementing this sort of work. In CathEd in New South Wales, we also had our own site that predated the national site, and it was called Partners for Learning. It's a centre of excellence that was funded under the National Partnership for Teacher Quality. So this is actually a site for teachers that uses the 7 key dimensions of effective partnership and then provides tools and resources for teachers to change their practice. So we've embedded this new tool on this site, and encouraging the Catholic schools to look at, putting those two together and capitalising on also all of the resources. In Catholic Ed 2 in New South Wales, we've taken the matrix and we're adapting it slightly for use in Catholic schools. That's allowed too. So that some of the language, for example, or some of the examples that we used in the matrix, we felt that we could put some localised examples in there. So we're currently working with principals and parents and classroom teachers to put in different sorts of examples for Catholic schools. So that'll go up with the national resource on this website. What we've also done is we've accredited PD with the New South Wales Institute of Teachers using this resource as the model. So when any of our teachers in New South Wales, in Catholic Ed and beyond in fact, come to a session that we're providing around this, they automatically get New South Wales Institute of Teachers accredited PD hours attached to it. Again, that seemed to be some way of getting teacher buy-in. Because I think that while school leadership is critically important to this work, if we're talking about the learning, then the classroom teacher as a leader of pedagogy and a leader in learning, this is incredibly important work because it changes fundamentally, I think, certain aspects of their teaching. So how do we build the capacity, of teachers to do this work? And this has just been our approach to doing it. So lots of PD for teachers and making sure that they get some benefit from undertaking that PD. We also have been running a series of masterclasses, so having sort of international guest speakers come and talking to school leadership teams, parent leaders and others about this sort of work. And slowly but surely we're seeing all the pieces come together, and the readiness for those schools to embark on a journey of school improvement is beginning to sort of emerge. And the other thing that we're doing is any of those teachers that are sort of accessing this sort of work, we're attaching them to the Partners for Learning Twitter account so they get constant updates about emerging research, emerging practice, examples of what schools are doing that they might like to emulate, that sort of stuff. So we've sort of said, okay, teachers are a really critical piece of this puzzle. How are we going to support teachers to implement this, but also to do what they do somewhat differently in their classrooms, so build their capacity and their confidence, but to provide the ongoing support through PD and other mechanisms. So they're just two ways that we've used the tool at a system level. What else will we be hearing from the schools as we've been around sort of Victoria and New South Wales? That you need to have a supportive leadership team to embark on this work. You also need to have, we believe, and I think this comes through very, very strongly in the Family School Partnership Framework, a team of people who are prepared to take this work forward. And now Joyce Epstein and others will call it a parent action team, but it could actually be a subset of your school board. It could be a subset of any other structures that you might currently have in the school. My suggestion would be, though, that whatever group that you pull together to sort of help drive this work reflects the community that school supports. So there's no point in having a very white, middle-class, Anglo-Saxon parent action team or, family engagement team if your school is 80-odd% multicultural or high Indigenous. Whoever's on your team kind of needs to reflect the community that this is going to affect. That we need to have an understanding of a shared understanding of the process. So there's some pre-planning that I think you need to do before you embark on this. A shared understanding of what the 7 key dimensions are, what effective practice looks like, but also critically important is what is the core business of this school and what's it going to look like in this school. Essentially, all of this work is bespoke. What a family school partnership looks like, what parent engagement looks like, is going to be unique to every school community. Everything that you need to know to do this work, you'll actually find in your communities. All this sort of this toolkit can help you almost put to paper what you know about your community or what you're learning about your community, and then begin sort of a planning process around it. Now, in terms of time, what time have we got for it to finish? And it's to finish at 1. The challenge I would put out there to you is that, I suppose, how might you use it? Because I think there's enormous value in this tool beyond schools. Partnership brokers, I think, can use this tool and adapt it for their purposes. I think that community agencies, I know that in Victoria, the Department of Community Services, I think that's what it's called, we're also looking about how can they use this tool when they're doing their work with schools. So where do we find those, the 3 circles, the complementary learning environments? So those who are in the community sector need to have sort of common messages and common understandings about how this sort of partnership stuff works. So I think it's not just for schools, it can be easily adapted for all sorts of organisations, departmental offices. So departments can use this sort of a tool to assess how they're tracking in terms of their parent and community engagement at those next levels, up. So I hope that's kind of given you a sense of what the tool is, that it's flexible enough to use in a whole range of ways, that can be adapted. But I say, go forth and play with it. And we would love to hear back from you from those, particularly from schools who've embarked on the process, and to hear their journeys and that sort of stuff. And I'm sure there's capacity to capture those stories on the Smarter Schools website. Where can you find it? So apart from the Partners for Learning site, if you're a Catholic school, you can access it from the DWA Smarter Schools website. It's not immediately easy to find. You have to kind of follow the links. So either you can write down this link, or you type in the parental engagement into the search engine and it should come up that way. But yes, so that's it from me.
Thank you, Danielle. That was really good. And this tool is one of the best things I've ever seen. I reckon it's going to be an answer to a lot of our problems. So it'll be great to see our schools starting to use it. Now, you may have noticed, Danielle, this morning there have been some lovely goodie bags handed out. Well, we're not giving you one just yet because you're back this afternoon and we don't want you to get your goodie bag and run away and not come to your session later on. But thank you very, very much.